A security guard mocked a young man on crutches. Seconds later, his brother folded the walkie in his hand, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He kicked a disabled boy to the floor, laughing as the crutches clattered beside him. Subscribe if you believe no cruelty to the defenseless should ever be forgiven. The crutches clattered against the metal tray as Malik struggled to balance himself with one arm, the other reaching to pull off his backpack. The security line wasn't moving. Behind him, impatient travelers sighed under their breath, the sound of zippers, rolling suitcases, and overhead announcements blurring into background noise. But Caleb Rowe noticed something else, something sharp in the silence. The voice. "Move it, kid." "You're holding up the whole line," came the bark. The words belonged to Officer Darren Voss, a thick-shouldered man whose red cheeks flushed deeper with each delay. He stood by the scanner, arms crossed, badge clipped to his vest, watching Malik as if he were an inconvenience instead of a child on crutches. Caleb immediately stepped forward. "He's doing his best," he said, his voice calm but firm. "His brace sets off the metal detector. He just needs a moment." Darren didn't look at Caleb. His eyes stayed locked on Malik, narrowing with annoyance. "Everyone's got an excuse," he muttered. "I've seen this act before." Malik looked up, lips pressed tight, trying not to draw attention to the flush spreading up his neck. He adjusted the grip on his crutches, wincing slightly as one slipped under his arm. Caleb's hand twitched at his side, the muscles in his jaw tightening. He could feel the shift, the way the mood had changed in a matter of seconds. The air, once filled with idle chatter and movement, had turned still. A mother 2 rows back leaned down and whispered to her son. A man in a business suit glanced up from his phone. People were starting to notice. Malik finally managed to lean his crutches on the side of the scanner and stepped forward, his leg brace visible through the gap in his pants. He reached for the handrail but stumbled, nearly tipping before catching himself. "Come on," Darren snapped. "It's not a circus act. You want attention, go to a hospital." "Hey," Caleb said, stepping forward now, closer than before. "That's enough." The officer raised an eyebrow, finally turning to meet Caleb's gaze. "You want to be next?" he said, half a joke, half a warning. Caleb's eyes didn't move. "I'm asking you to do your job. Not harass a kid who's trying to walk." Darren let out a slow exhale, lips curling into a smirk. "And I'm asking you to step back and let security do its job." Unless you want to be detained for interference, Malik froze mid-step. The word detained wasn't just noise, it had weight, especially here, especially now. Caleb knew the pattern. He'd seen men like Darren before. This wasn't about security, it was about control, and Darren was the type who liked showing who had it. The line behind them backed up, passengers now fully alert, some quietly filming with their phones. Caleb could feel the heat rising, not just from the confrontation but from the pressure of eyes, the judgment, the helplessness. "I'm not interfering," Caleb said, voice lower now. "I'm protecting my brother." That word, protecting, hung in the air for a second longer than necessary. Darren's smirk disappeared. He stepped forward, pushing past Caleb, and snatched one of the crutches leaning on the side of the scanner. He held it up with mock confusion. "You mean this? You sure he needs it?" "Looks like he's managing fine." Caleb's hand moved fast, grabbing the crutch from Darren's grip before Malik could reach. "Give it back." "Oh," Darren said, raising his voice just enough for the nearby guards to look over. "Getting aggressive now." The words weren't a threat. They were a trap. Caleb saw it instantly. This was how it always started. Twist the narrative. Push until the victim defends themselves, then cry foul. Malik stepped forward again, his leg trembling slightly under the brace. He reached for his crutch, but Darren didn't move aside. Instead, his foot shifted, just barely, almost unnoticeably toward the boy's injured leg. "Don't," Caleb said, louder this time. But Darren didn't listen. With a motion so fast it seemed accidental, except it wasn't. Darren's boot swept forward and struck Malik's leg directly on the brace. The boy collapsed with a strangled scream. The sound tore through the terminal like glass shattering. Bags dropped. Phones flew up. Crutches hit the ground with a metallic clang, and Malik curled on the floor, gasping in pain, his fingers trembling as they reached for the brace. Caleb didn't move. He couldn't, not yet. For half a second, the world slowed to a crawl. Darren stood there, arms wide, trying to act like it hadn't happened, but the way his jaw tightened said otherwise. A security guard nearby called for backup into his radio, eyes darting between the officer and the fallen boy. Caleb dropped to his knees beside his brother, his hand gently touching Malik's shoulder. "I'm okay," Malik choked, though his face said otherwise. "Don't do anything. Please." But Caleb was already rising. He looked at Darren, not with rage but with something far colder. His voice, when he spoke, was flat and controlled. "You just kicked a child with a disability." Darren scoffed, brushing invisible dust from his vest. "He fell. Wasn't watching where he was going." "Say that again," Caleb said quietly. Darren turned, jaw squared, ready to speak, but paused. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were filming. Dozens of phones pointed like quiet weapons, capturing everything. The blood on Malik's knee, the bent crutch, the look in Caleb's eyes. Darren reached for his walkie, muttering into it quickly. "Possible disturbance. Need support," but no one believed his version anymore. Caleb didn't look away as Malik whimpered softly behind him. He wasn't thinking about headlines or consequences. He wasn't thinking about his job, his future, or the courtroom. He was only thinking of the boy on the floor, the boy who trusted him to always protect him, and the man who had just betrayed every ounce of power entrusted to him. "He didn't know yet," the narrator whispers, "that a single cruel kick would change everything." The accusation came without warning. "You're not even trying," Darren Voss snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the ambient hum of Northgate International's terminal. "Some of you just pretend to be weak to hold up the line." Malik, halfway through balancing his weight between the metal detector arch and the plastic security bin, looked up in shock. His crutches lay on the floor beside him, and the gray brace wrapped around his left leg glinted under the fluorescent lights. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to explain, voice soft and cracking. "My brace sets off the alarms. I can't take it off. I just need a second." Darren folded his arms across his chest, his posture loud with contempt. "Save it." "I've seen all the tricks," he muttered, then louder. "Move." Now behind them, the impatient shuffle of luggage wheels and restless murmurs of the line grew louder, pressing on the moment like a tightening vice. Malik's cheeks flushed, eyes darting to the ground, trying to disappear. But there was no vanishing from this spotlight. Caleb stepped forward slowly, his hands up, open-palmed, a silent language of peace. "Sir, he's injured," he said, measured and calm. "He's not faking." "Let me help him through." "No," Darren barked, cutting him off mid-sentence. The officer's body shifted in front of Caleb, blocking the space with an almost theatrical authority. "Back behind the line." He stretched an arm out and shoved Caleb lightly on the chest. Not hard, but enough. Enough to send a message. "I'm in control." Caleb didn't flinch, but his expression shifted, something internal hardening. Malik, still trying to lift his crutches back up, winced as one slipped from his grasp. As he bent down to retrieve it, Darren extended his foot and nudged the crutch away, subtle but unmistakable. Malik nearly lost his balance again, one hand gripping the security table for support. That's when Darren smirked. "Special treatment, huh?" he said under his breath, just loud enough for the brothers to hear. From the back of the crowd, a man in a navy windbreaker angled his phone discreetly, the lens blinking red as it recorded. A woman whispered to her husband. Another passenger glanced nervously toward the overhead monitor, but no one stepped in. Caleb's breathing slowed, deep and deliberate. "You need to stop," he said, voice flat now. The warmth in his tone was gone. Darren didn't stop. Instead, in a split second of cruelty disguised as impatience, he stepped forward, his heavy boot colliding directly with Malik's injured leg. The sound that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp. A single, involuntary yelp from Malik as his body folded, collapsing to the floor. The boy's scream shattered the illusion of order in the terminal. His crutches clattered violently across the tiles, echoing like thunder in a cathedral. People gasped. A woman cried out. A suitcase toppled behind them as someone jerked back in shock. Malik lay curled on the floor, arms wrapped tightly around his leg, face twisted in agony. Tears streamed down his cheeks, not just from pain, but humiliation. Caleb didn't move at first. Not because he didn't care, but because his mind was calculating, processing every possible action in the span of a breath. He could hear his own heartbeat, feel it in his throat, in his fingertips, in his temples. The engineer in him searched for logic, for diplomacy, but it was drowned in the scream of his brother. Darren stepped back casually, one hand drifting toward his belt. Not the weapon, not yet, but the walkie. His thumb pressed down. "I've got a problem at Lane 3, he began. "Male subject refusing orders, possible resistance." Caleb's eyes flicked to the walkie, then to Darren's face, then back to Malik, still crying on the floor. His hands clenched, his jaw set. A security officer moved to the edge of the checkpoint, radioing instructions, but didn't come forward. The others remained frozen, some unsure, some unwilling. The bystanders, still only recording, still only watching. Caleb dropped to his knees next to Malik, his hand hovering above his brother's shoulder. "You okay?" he whispered, his voice like sandpaper, strained, tight. Malik nodded weakly, mouthing, "Don't let him win." The words cut through the fog like a flare. Caleb rose slowly, one knee at a time. When he stood fully, he turned to Darren with the stillness of a brewing storm. His voice dropped lower, colder. "You just kicked a child with a disability." Darren gave a bitter laugh, one corner of his mouth twitching. "Don't make this harder on yourself." But the walkie in his hand trembled. The surrounding passengers grew louder now, some calling for supervisors, others yelling at the officer. Phones rose higher, capturing angles, documenting injustice. But no one moved. Caleb did. One step forward. No yelling, no threats, just intent. Darren tried to backpedal, raising the walkie as if it were a shield. But Caleb's hand moved faster, smoother. He reached out and snatched it midair, twisting it from Darren's grip with a clean, practiced motion. The radio snapped violently in his palm, wires sparking from the fractured plastic. Everyone around froze. "What the?" Darren started. But Caleb wasn't listening anymore. He wasn't a passenger. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't even an engineer in that moment. He was a brother. And the look in his eyes said one thing: no more warnings. The line between restraint and retribution, the narrator notes, was about to vanish forever. The moment Malik hit the floor, the sound tore through the terminal like glass shattering. His crutches skidded across the polished tiles, clattering against a nearby stanchion before spinning to a stop. For a heartbeat, the world froze. The security line went silent except for the echo of Malik's cry, a raw, human sound that sliced through the sterile hum of the airport. Then chaos erupted. Travelers gasped, some shouting in disbelief, others fumbling for their phones to record what they had just witnessed. Mothers shielded their children, and an elderly man near the front of the line shook his head, muttering under his breath, "He kicked a kid. Dear God, he kicked a kid." Darren Voss's voice cracked through the uproar, sharp and defensive. "Stay back. Everyone stay where you are." He barked into his walkie, his words tumbling over each other. "Code Delta, need backup at checkpoint 3. Passenger assaulting an officer." His tone carried the desperation of someone already spinning a false story. Caleb barely registered the words. He was already kneeling beside Malik, who was curled on his side, clutching his leg in agony. Blood darkened the fabric of his brace where the officer's boot had struck. Caleb's hands hovered for a second, trembling as he checked his brother's breathing. Malik's chest rose and fell in short, ragged bursts, his face pale and wet with tears. "Malik, look at me," Caleb said quietly, his voice shaking despite the effort to stay calm. "You're okay." "I'm right here." Malik's fingers tightened around his arm. "It hurts," the boy whispered, his voice fragile. Caleb swallowed hard, his throat burning. Around them, the terminal buzzed with confusion and fear. A few passengers shouted for medical help, while others argued with the guards, their voices rising in outrage. "You can't just hit a kid like that," someone yelled. But Darren ignored them all, clutching his walkie as if it were a shield. "Step back, sir," another security guard ordered, approaching Caleb. The man's hand hovered near his belt, tension in his posture. Caleb stood slowly, his frame straightening inch by inch. His breathing steadied, but his eyes, those calm, analytical eyes that had built drones and machines, now carried a fire that refused to be contained. His voice was low but unyielding. "You just kicked a child with a disability." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Darren let out a short, mocking laugh. "He was obstructing the line," he said, his lip curling. "I acted in self-defense." The absurdity of the claim drew a murmur of disbelief from the crowd. Caleb's jaw tightened, his fists curling at his sides. Darren's hand hovered near his holster, his eyes darting between Caleb and the growing number of recording phones pointed in his direction. "Sir, I'm warning you," he said, trying to sound authoritative, but the edge of panic in his voice betrayed him. Malik shifted on the floor, his voice trembling but resolute. "Don't let him win," he whispered, the words barely audible through his pain. Caleb looked down at him, and in that instant, something inside him hardened. The world seemed to narrow until all he could see was his brother and the man who had hurt him. He took a step forward, not fast, not reckless, but deliberate, like a man who had already accepted the consequences of his next move. The tension was suffocating. Every breath in the room seemed to hold weight. Darren's thumb pressed against the emergency button on his walkie. "Security, this is Officer Voss. Subject is becoming hostile." His words were rushed, almost frantic. But before he could finish, Caleb's hand shot forward. In a blur of emotion, he snatched the device mid-air, twisting Darren's wrist with precise force. The move wasn't wild, it was calculated. Years of working with delicate machinery had taught him how to apply pressure exactly where it mattered. The walkie cracked under his grip, its plastic casing splitting like brittle bone. A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd. Darren stumbled backward, his face twisting between pain and disbelief. "You're making a big mistake," he hissed, clutching his wrist. Caleb's voice came out low, calm, and terrifyingly certain. "The only mistake was thinking you could hurt him and walk away." Another guard stepped forward, uncertain whether to intervene. His eyes darted between Caleb's controlled stance and Darren's trembling form. "Sir, just stand down," the guard said hesitantly, though his voice lacked conviction. Behind him, the flashing red lights of an approaching security team reflected off the glass walls, growing brighter by the second. But Caleb didn't move. His focus was absolute, his breathing measured. Darren tried to regain his composure, straightening his uniform with his uninjured hand. "You'll go to prison for this," he spat. Caleb didn't respond. Instead, he dropped the broken walkie to the floor, its speaker crackling faintly, emitting a distorted hum that filled the silence between them. The sound was eerie, mechanical, like a warning from something far larger than either of them. In that moment, every person watching understood the gravity of what had just happened. The engineer who once designed tools to protect lives now stood as a man who had been pushed beyond reason. Malik, lying on the floor, watched with wide eyes, not in fear, but in awe. He saw the brother who had always shielded him, standing taller than he ever had before. Caleb's shoulders rose and fell with each breath, the fury inside him simmering into something colder, more precise. Darren took one last step toward him, puffing his chest in an attempt to reclaim control. "You think this makes you a hero?" he sneered. Caleb's eyes flicked down to Malik, then back to Darren. "No," he said quietly. "It makes me a brother." The words struck like a hammer. For a moment, even the background noise of the terminal seemed to fade. The distant announcements, the rolling luggage, the murmuring passengers, all drowned beneath the weight of what had just been said. Darren's confidence faltered, and for the first time, he seemed to realize he had lost more than control. He had lost the narrative. As security reinforcements finally rushed in, their footsteps echoing across the polished floor, Caleb raised his hands slowly, surrendering without a word. The officers surrounded him, shouting commands, but his gaze remained fixed on Malik, who managed a faint nod from where he lay. A fragile understanding passed between them. This was only the beginning. The walkie still hissed faintly at their feet, its broken signal flickering in and out, like a heartbeat struggling to continue. And in that charged silence, as Caleb stood amidst flashing lights and raised voices, the narrator's words echoed softly in the reader's mind, sealing the moment with unshakable finality. "Some moments," the narrator reflects, "don't ask for reason, they demand response." The crack of plastic snapping echoed like a gunshot across the terminal. Caleb didn't hesitate. The moment Darren's walkie-talkie was halfway raised to his mouth, Caleb's hand shot out and gripped the officer's wrist with startling force. There was no rage in his eyes, only precision, cold and exact. In one fluid motion he twisted the wrist back against its joint, the way he had once learned in a university self-defense seminar. The walkie shattered between their hands with a sharp pop, the broken halves tumbling to the floor as gasps erupted from the bystanders. Darren reeled back, clutching his wrist, his face contorted in disbelief and rising panic. "You broke!" he started, but Caleb was already moving. With his breath steady but chest tight, Caleb stepped in, closing the distance. His brother still lay on the floor behind him, whimpering softly, and that sound, more than the shouting crowd, more than the alarms beginning to blare, anchored his focus like a steel wire through his chest. This wasn't about impulse. This was about something Darren Voss had never understood: consequence. Caleb reached down, grabbed the top half of the broken radio from the floor, and without pause, shoved it into Darren's mouth. The officer choked, stumbling backward as the jagged edges pressed against his gums and tongue. His eyes bulged in shock. A gurgled, inhuman sound escaped him, muffled and broken as he fell against the metal table and slid down its side. Blood trickled from his lip as he clawed at the device, gagging. The terminal froze. For a breathless second, no one moved, not the travelers who had gathered in silent clusters, not the other guards who watched with wide eyes, and not the employees behind the counters. The only sound came from the walkie's broken speaker, which emitted a distorted crackle of static, as though the radio itself was trying to speak one last time. Caleb stood tall, his chest rising and falling with slow, heavy breaths. He looked down at Darren, who now sat on the floor gasping, trying to cough the device from his throat, spitting blood onto his sleeves. Caleb's hands were still raised slightly, his fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the release of everything he had been holding in since the moment that man kicked his brother. A second officer took one step forward but hesitated. Caleb met his eyes, not with fury, but with clarity. "He kicked my brother," Caleb said, his voice even and strong, echoing off the glass and steel of the terminal. "A child. A disabled child." Another officer whispered into his shoulder radio, asking for backup, but made no move to detain Caleb. Cameras flashed again. Someone shouted Caleb's name from the crowd. He didn't look. He was still watching Malik. Malik lay on his side, his hands gripping the brace on his leg. His face was twisted with pain, but when he looked up at his brother, his lips moved faintly. Caleb couldn't hear the words, but he saw the nod. It was slow and strained, but it was there. A nod of trust, of pride, of shared strength. Airport police finally arrived. 2 uniformed men with tactical vests rushed forward, one kneeling beside Darren, the other approaching Caleb cautiously. "Sir, please place your hands where I can see them," the officer said firmly, though his voice trembled. Caleb didn't resist. His arms rose slowly, deliberately. He didn't flinch when the handcuffs were snapped around his wrists, didn't struggle as they turned him around. He looked only at Malik, never taking his eyes off his brother until they forced him to turn. Behind him, the crowd had begun to shift. Some recorded. Others stood in stunned silence. A few clapped. Most didn't know what to do with what they had just witnessed. An act of violence, yes, but also something deeper, something born from a place beyond anger. As the officers led Caleb away, the walkie still buzzed faintly on the floor beside Darren's boot. The broken speaker crackled with what sounded like a fading voice, static layered over distant words, too garbled to make out. Caleb didn't speak again as he passed through the terminal, but his eyes said enough. Not fear, not regret. Resolve. And somewhere beneath the weight of it all, the cameras, the sirens, and the flashing lights, Malik's voice still echoed in his mind. Don't let him win. In that single instant, the narrator concludes, Caleb stopped being an engineer and became a reckoning. The sound of Malik's scream still echoed through the terminal as the first wave of airport security swarmed in. Flashing lights and sharp commands sliced through the chaos. Travelers shouted over one another, some trying to flee the area while others continued to record, their phones raised like torches. Caleb knelt beside his brother, his hands trembling as he checked the boy's breathing. Malik winced, gripping his thigh, his face pale from shock. Blood soaked through the bottom edge of his jeans. Caleb didn't speak. He couldn't, not yet. His entire world had narrowed to the painful gasps of his brother and the furious beat of his own heart. Then came the hand on his shoulder. "Sir, step away." "Now!" barked one of the incoming officers, his vest marked with Northgate Authority insignia. Caleb rose slowly, lifting both hands above his head, the crushed walkie still clutched in one palm. Another officer yanked it from him, tossing it aside without looking. Darren Voss lay a few feet away, half sitting, half sprawled against the wall, moaning through a mouth still red from impact. His eyes locked on Caleb with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. Even now, he tried to look like the one who had been attacked. His voice cracked as he pointed. "He's unstable! He assaulted me." Caleb didn't flinch. He kicked a child who couldn't fight back. That was all he said. Within minutes, Caleb was escorted away in handcuffs, not roughly, but with quiet urgency. The officers had seen the footage by then. Some of them exchanged glances but said nothing. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about pressure, procedure, and what came next. Inside a white-walled holding room deep in the administrative wing, Caleb sat alone, his wrists cuffed to the table in front of him. The room was cold. Metal chairs, buzzing fluorescent lights, and a wall clock that ticked too loudly. An officer entered briefly to take basic information but didn't stay long. Caleb remained calm, staring forward, replaying the moment in his head again and again, the look on Malik's face when he fell, the sound of his crutches clattering, Darren's smirk. He didn't regret it. Not for a second. Outside, the world had exploded. News vans parked like vultures near the terminal's edge. Reporters jostled for space, shouting questions no one could yet answer. The incident had hit social media before the ambulance had even left the curb. One clip showed Darren's boot making contact with Malik's leg, the boy's scream cutting through even the poor phone audio. Another clip, from a different angle, showed Caleb's retaliation, the walkie being driven into Darren's mouth. The internet didn't wait for courtrooms. opinions split instantly. Some users praised Caleb's restraint, claiming anyone else would have done worse. Others called it a dangerous escalation. Hashtags started trending within the hour. Hashtag Justice for Malik, hashtag Protect the Disabled, and hashtag End Abuse of Authority. Victor Wren was in his office downtown when the footage landed in his inbox. The civil rights attorney watched it once, then again. A soft exhale left his lips. His assistant, Robert, hovered in the doorway. "That him?" Robert asked. Victor nodded. "That's not assault," he murmured. "That's someone who reached his limit." Without another word, Victor picked up his phone and dialed a contact at the Northgate Police Department. He had seen too many cases like this, power being used to intimidate the vulnerable, and justice hesitating too long to respond. But this one felt different. The cameras had captured everything. The story had a witness in every corner of the terminal. This wasn't just a case, it was a reckoning. Back at the airport, protesters began to gather as word spread. What began as a few murmured arguments in the food court became a crowd near the security entrance. Some held handwritten signs, others simply stood in silence, holding up phones playing the video on loop. A man in a faded construction vest stood near the front, holding a sign that read, "My son uses crutches too." Another read, "One kick too far." Inside the hospital, Malik lay on a stiff cot, IV fluid dripping slowly beside him. His leg was elevated, and the pain medication was only just starting to help. A nurse checked his vitals, and a young male doctor updated the chart, speaking quietly to a nearby officer assigned to take a statement. Malik didn't speak for a while. He just watched the ceiling, blinking slowly. Then he whispered, "Did Caleb get arrested?" The nurse hesitated, then nodded. "They're holding him for now." "But your brother? He didn't leave your side until help came." Malik's hand curled around the edge of the blanket. He nodded once, then closed his eyes. In the holding room, Caleb finally heard the door open again. 2 detectives entered, both in plainclothes, both tense. They sat opposite him without introducing themselves. One began a formal interview, recording device on, clipboard in hand. Caleb answered every question clearly, but with only what mattered. He didn't elaborate, didn't apologize, didn't try to justify. "He kicked a child who couldn't fight back," Caleb repeated again, voice steady. "Everything else came after that." They stared at him for a long moment. One of them looked like he wanted to say something more, but the recorder clicked off. The interview was done. Down the hallway, another officer stepped outside and glanced at his phone. Messages were pouring in, news articles, public reaction. His fingers hovered above the screen before he whispered to no one, "It's already too late to hide this." Back in the quiet of the interview room, Caleb leaned forward slightly, his cuffs clinking as he rested his arms on the table. Through the window, a line of clouds began to roll in over the airport's northern wing. A storm was building. He closed his eyes for a moment, not in defeat, but in preparation. Outside, the protests grew louder. Drivers honked as they passed. Reporters updated their broadcasts live. Among the growing crowd, a sign lifted higher than the rest caught the wind. It read in bold black letters, "They started it with a kick. I'll finish it with the truth." By the next morning, the footage had already ignited a wildfire. News anchors across every major network repeated the same loop, a slow-motion replay of Darren Voss's boot connecting with Malik's braced leg, the boy's scream rising sharply as he collapsed onto the cold terminal floor. Then the retaliation. The moment Caleb Rowe, eyes narrowed and jaw clenched, seized the walkie-talkie and forced it into Darren's mouth. Those few seconds became the most discussed visual in the country. Some saw a brutal attack, others saw a brother drawing a line the world had crossed one too many times. At Westbridge Medical Center, the sterile walls of Malik's hospital room glowed dimly under morning light. The boy lay still, bruises marking the contours of his knee and thigh, his leg elevated and wrapped in thick gauze. A tray of untouched breakfast sat at his side. Across from him, Caleb sat in a hard plastic chair, unmoving, his hands folded and his eyes unfocused. He hadn't slept. The events kept looping in his mind. The moment Malik fell, the crack of the walkie, the security guards who stood by doing nothing. The silence had been more painful than the noise. On the television in the corner, a reporter's voice filtered through. Public reaction to the Northgate incident continues to escalate as the video reaches over 6 million views in just 12 hours. Civil rights groups are organizing demonstrations at airports in several cities, demanding accountability and reform. Caleb didn't flinch, but Malik stirred and glanced toward him. "You didn't have to do that," Malik said softly, his voice thin but clear. "I did," Caleb replied, his voice flat but resolute. He turned toward his brother. "You were on the ground." And they laughed. Malik's eyes welled slightly, not from pain, but from the weight of understanding. "I know," he whispered. "I just don't want you to get in trouble because of me." The door opened, breaking the heavy silence. Victor Wren entered the room, sharply dressed in a charcoal suit, his expression serious but calm. He was a man who had spent years battling injustice, and his face bore the quiet confidence of someone used to swimming against the current. "They filed charges," Victor said without preamble, stepping closer. "Assault. Darren Voss claims he acted in defense. The airport authority released a vague statement saying they've launched an internal investigation, but it's clear they're trying to manage this from a distance. They're protecting themselves. Not you." Caleb stood slowly. "Let them come," he said. "I'm not ashamed of what I did." Victor nodded, admiring the strength in his voice. "We're not going to back down." "But make no mistake, they're going to try to spin this. Voss is already doing interviews. He's in a neck brace, wrapped in bandages. He's playing the victim to the press. Says he was attacked without warning." "That man kicked a disabled child," Caleb said, his voice rising slightly, eyes flashing with fury. "I didn't attack him. I stopped him." Victor stepped forward and placed a file on the side table. "The footage helps. But public opinion is split. Some people think you went too far. Others think you didn't go far enough. We're walking a line, Caleb. This isn't just about what happened in that terminal anymore. This is about the country watching, trying to decide what kind of response is acceptable when power is abused." Caleb looked down at Malik, then at his own hands. "I build things for a living, Mr. Wren. I design drones for search and rescue. I build machines to save people. I never thought I'd be the one breaking something to protect someone I love." Victor nodded slowly, understanding. "Sometimes the world pushes too hard, Caleb. Sometimes it's not about building. It's about drawing a line." The hospital door opened again, this time letting in 2 men in suits, plainclothes detectives. One of them stepped forward, badge visible. "Mr. Rowe," he said, formal and emotionless, "we'd like to ask you to come with us for a statement. You're not under arrest, but we need to get your version on record." Caleb met the detective's eyes, his own face calm. "I won't run." "I'll answer every question." Victor turned to the officers. "He'll come, but I'll be present. You touch him without cause, I'll have your department in court before lunch." The detectives didn't flinch but nodded. Caleb stepped toward the door, then paused and looked back at his brother. "I'll be all right," he said. Malik managed a small, crooked smile. "You didn't just defend me, Caleb. You defended every kid who's ever been hurt for being different." Caleb stood for a moment, silent. Then, as if a heavy weight settled evenly across his shoulders, he gave a faint nod and walked out the door beside Victor and the detectives. "And now," the narrator says, "the fight was shifting from the floor of the airport to the walls of a courtroom." The courtroom was silent as the bailiff called the session to order. Reporters pressed close to the wooden barriers, their pens poised, cameras blinking like distant lightning. Caleb Rowe sat at the defendant's table, his hands folded, knuckles pale against the polished oak surface. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, but his posture was not that of a man hoping to impress. It was the posture of someone containing something dangerous. His expression was composed, but his eyes carried the weight of everything he had endured in the past 2 weeks. Across the aisle, Darren Voss entered, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. He limped theatrically, a foam neck brace exaggerating each step, bandages stretched across his jaw. The moment he passed the jury box, he groaned audibly. Some jurors glanced at him with sympathy. Others looked skeptical. But Caleb never turned his head. He stared straight ahead, every muscle tight. The prosecutor rose first, clearing his throat as he addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, gesturing toward Caleb with careful cadence, "this case is not about emotions. It is about a public act of violence, an attack that unfolded in front of dozens of travelers, an attack that left an officer of the law hospitalized." He paused for effect. Mr. Rowe may have believed he was protecting his brother, but in doing so, he took justice into his own hands. We cannot permit chaos in our transportation hubs. The defendant lost control. Today, we hold him accountable. As the prosecutor returned to his seat, Victor Wren, Caleb's attorney, rose slowly. A tall man with a sharp beard and an unshakable voice, Victor's presence seemed to steady the air. He walked to the center of the courtroom and faced the jury. "What would you do," he said plainly, "if someone kicked a child who couldn't defend himself? What would you do if that child was your family?" He waited, letting the question settle. "You will hear many arguments today about policy, about duty, about rules. But I ask you to look closely at the facts. Not just the retaliation, but the provocation." He turned and nodded toward the judge. With a quiet gesture, he signaled the technician seated near the bench. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as a monitor flickered to life. Victor spoke softly. "This is the footage taken from the terminal cameras." The moment the victim, Malik Rowe, was kicked by Officer Voss, gasps echoed through the chamber. On screen, Darren's leg swung forward sharply, connecting with the brace on Malik's leg. The boy's crutches flew into the air. The scream that followed silenced even the clatter of the falling metal. One juror put a hand over his mouth. Another closed his eyes. Even the judge leaned back, visibly disturbed. Victor paused the video. This is what started it. Not anger, not vengeance. Payne, Darren's attorney, leapt up. "Objection. Context." "Sustained," the judge replied, but his voice lacked conviction. As the video stopped, Caleb stared at the frozen image of his brother falling. He remembered that moment with perfect clarity, the crack of metal, the shout of surprise, the flash of disbelief turning into white-hot fury. He had not imagined it. The world had seen it now. Darren's defense attorney took a different route. He pointed at Caleb with careful words, portraying him as a man who snapped under stress and used humiliation as punishment. He leaned heavily on Darren's record of duty and repeated that the officer was just doing his job. Throughout it all, Caleb remained silent until the judge called him to the stand. He rose, stepped forward, and raised his right hand as the bailiff swore him in. Taking the seat, he adjusted the microphone and glanced at the courtroom. Victor spoke gently. "Mr. Rowe, in your own words, what happened that day?" Caleb looked at the jury, then down at his hands. His voice was low, but unwavering. "My brother is 14. He walks with a brace. That day, we were coming back from a tech conference. I designed a drone system for a defense project, and Malik came with me to see the presentation. He was proud. He felt safe. He swallowed hard. Until someone decided he was a problem." He paused. Darren Voss didn't just yell at him. He mocked him. He pushed him. He kicked him, and no one stopped him. Not one other guard, not one bystander. I didn't attack him. I reacted to what no one else stopped. The room held its breath. The judge looked down, scribbled something on his notepad, and nodded to Victor. "You may step down." Caleb returned to his seat as murmurs passed through the courtroom. Meanwhile, in a back office of Victor's law firm, a quiet technician had just sent an encrypted message. Jonas Cade, a night shift IT staffer at Northgate Airport, had spent days reviewing the security logs of that evening. And now, with his jaw clenched and fingers shaking, he uploaded a folder to Victor's inbox. Inside was a treasure trove, audio files from the control room, backups no one else had thought to delete. One of them caught Darren's voice before the altercation. "I'll make that kid move faster even if I have to kick him." Another man laughed. Jonas closed the laptop, took a deep breath, and whispered to himself, "Let the truth speak." Back in the courtroom, Caleb sat quietly while Victor read a new alert on his phone. His brow furrowed. Then it lifted. He passed the device discreetly to his assistant. The game was about to change. Sometimes, the narrator remarks, justice hides in the places no one bothers to check. The security officer struck the black kid hard, mocking his limp, unaware that his older brother, standing nearby, was a Marine with zero tolerance for injustice. If you believe every act of abuse must be answered, hit subscribe now. Justice starts here. The courtroom was silent, thick with the tension of expectation, when Victor Wren walked to the center, flash drive in hand. He didn't say a word at first. The murmurs from the gallery quieted as he held it up like a key to a locked truth. The judge watched closely, brows slightly raised. Darren Voss, sitting stiffly in his neck brace beside his legal team, wore the same smug look he'd worn since day one, confident the tide would turn back in his favor. Victor's voice finally broke the stillness. "Your Honor, this evidence was submitted to our office anonymously, but we've since confirmed its chain of custody. Inside are internal audio logs captured from the security booth minutes before the incident." There was a pause, small but purposeful, as Victor approached the AV technician seated near the jury box. "Play, clip 1. The courtroom speakers crackled softly, and then came the unmistakable voice of Darren Voss. "I'll make that kid move faster, even if I have to kick him." The words hit the air like a hammer. Audible gasps rose from the gallery. Even the judge leaned forward, lips parting slightly. In the recording, another male voice, an officer nearby, laughed. "You're not serious," the man chuckled. "I'll do it," Darren's voice insisted. "Crutches or not." "He's slowing up my line." Inside the defendant's area, Caleb didn't move. His eyes remained fixed ahead, but something behind them shifted. Less rage, more confirmation. The thing he knew in his bones now had proof. Beside him, Victor let the silence stretch for a moment longer, ensuring every juror absorbed the weight of what they'd just heard. Darren's smirk faded. His lips twitched into a grimace as his defense attorney leaned in, whispering frantically. "Play clip 2, Victor said calmly. The next recording was shorter, but no less damning. The same officer who had laughed earlier was now heard saying, "You really kicked him? Man, that's going to bite you." "Just a nudge," Darren answered coolly on the tape. "He'll milk it for sympathy." A collective reaction swept through the courtroom, part outrage, part disbelief. The judge motioned to stop the audio. His voice came sharp and cold. "Are these files verified, Mr. Wren?" Victor was ready. "Yes, Your Honor." Forensics confirmed the audio's authenticity, and we've brought in 2 additional witnesses to identify the voices he turned toward the doors at the rear of the courtroom. They opened, revealing 2 men, Airport Maintenance Technician Eli York and Shift Supervisor Brendan Chase. Both had listened to the clips prior to court and were prepared to testify. Under oath, Eli spoke first, his voice firm despite visible nerves. That was Darren Voss. No doubt. I've worked near the checkpoint for 2 years. That's him Brendan followed. Same here. I reported to his unit until recently. That's his voice, and the other officer laughing as Rick Palmer Victor nodded to the judge, who scribbled something on his notepad before looking directly at Darren. Do you wish to contest the authenticity of these recordings, Mr. Voss? Darren's lawyer stood, hesitant. Your Honor, we question the chain of custody. The source remains. The source is irrelevant when the voices have been verified by both staff and independent analysis, the judge interrupted. Proceed. The damage was done. Darren sat frozen, hands clenched in his lap, color draining from his face. Outside the courthouse, the effect of the tapes was immediate. News alerts exploded across social media. Protesters already gathered on the courthouse steps erupted into renewed chants. Signs that once read, "Justice for Malik," now doubled in size and fury, with new ones appearing by the hour. Kick one, wake thousands, and accountability is not optional. Reporters shoved microphones toward anyone leaving the courtroom, but Caleb, as always, remained quiet. He exited with Victor, flanked by supporters, his gaze steady beneath the weight of 100 camera flashes. A young journalist called out, "Mr. Rowe, do you feel the evidence has changed the tide of the trial?" Caleb paused. For once, he answered. His voice was low but clear. "If this brings change," he said, "then the fight was worth it." From the far end of the crowd, Malik stood leaning on one crutch, a brace still visible beneath his pant leg. He caught his brother's eye and gave a small, crooked smile. Caleb returned it, almost imperceptibly. He had struck back not just for his brother, the narrator reflects, but for every injustice that had gone unseen. The accusation hit like a thunderclap. Darren's attorney stood tall before the judge, voice sharp and cold. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe the audio evidence was tampered with. We move for immediate suspension of the trial, pending verification of its authenticity." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Caleb's hands clenched in his lap as Victor slowly rose, trying to contain his disbelief. "This is a desperate attempt to distract from the truth," he countered, but the judge, stone-faced and cautious, raised a hand. "Given the gravity of the allegation, I have no choice but to temporarily suspend proceedings until the integrity of the evidence is confirmed," the judge ruled, his gavel striking with a finality that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Outside the courtroom, the air had turned bitter. Protesters who had once held signs with hopeful slogans now exchanged uncertain glances. News outlets jumped on the development, spinning headlines that ranged from "Trial stalled amid tampering accusations" to "Whistleblower under scrutiny." Jonas Cade, the technician who had risked everything to expose the truth, found himself doubted and demonized in the span of a single afternoon. Back in the holding room, Caleb sat on the edge of a bench, his jaw tight. His phone buzzed again, another anonymous message, short and cruel. "Back off before you regret it." He deleted it without blinking, but his stomach churned with the feeling that was growing less like anger and more like dread. Victor stepped in, rubbing his temple. "It's getting dirty," he muttered. "We expected resistance, but this? They're pulling strings we haven't even seen yet." Caleb didn't look up. "They're not just trying to protect Darren," he said, voice low. "They're trying to bury the whole system." That night, things got worse. Malik's school principal called, concerned. Someone had left voicemails claiming Malik was a threat to campus peace and demanding his removal for safety reasons. Caleb nearly dropped the phone. "He's a kid recovering from an assault, not a threat," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, but the fear was undeniable now. Even Malik noticed it. "I'm not scared," Malik said quietly as Caleb tucked him into bed. "They just want us to be." Caleb tried to smile, brushing his brother's hair gently. "I know," he whispered, "but that doesn't mean I'll let them." The next morning, Victor made a decision. "We're being targeted. This isn't just about the case, it's a cover-up." He tapped his phone. "I'm bringing someone in." Enter Mason Dre. He arrived without ceremony. A quiet man in his early 40s, Mason wore a wrinkled gray coat and carried a small battered laptop bag. His handshake was brief but firm. "Victor said you needed digital footprints followed," he said simply. Caleb studied him. There was nothing flashy about Mason, no dramatic flair, but his eyes, sharp, focused, always calculating, told Caleb everything he needed to know. "Start with Jonas," Victor instructed. "See if anyone tried to access or alter his records. Then dig into airport administration. I want everything. Emails, logs, back-end systems. If they're hiding something, I want it dragged into the light." Mason nodded. "Give me 48 hours." He didn't take 48. 36 hours later, Mason returned with a flash drive and a single sheet of paper. He placed them on the table, his voice as calm as ever. "Encrypted emails. Deleted but recovered from a hidden archive. Senior officials at the airport, including the head of security, ordered internal staff to delete surveillance footage before the incident went public." Victor's face darkened. "They knew. And they tried to erase it. There's more," Mason added, pulling up a file on his laptop. They referred to Caleb and Malik as liabilities. One message reads, "If this story gains traction, shut it down, discredit the tech, and bury the kid's image." Caleb's knuckles turned white. Victor snapped upright. "This isn't just suppression. It's systemic rot." With this new evidence in hand, Victor filed an emergency motion and forwarded the documents to the Federal Ethics Commission, calling for an immediate federal inquiry. The judge, upon reviewing the material, lifted the trial suspension and ordered further investigation into the airport's leadership. As reporters scrambled to keep up, protesters returned in force, this time not just demanding justice for Caleb and Malik, but for all victims of unchecked power hidden behind uniforms and procedure. News anchors spoke of a reckoning in national security protocol, and politicians began issuing cautious statements. Through it all, Caleb sat beside Malik, holding his brother's hand as he stared out the hospital window. For the first time in weeks, he felt something shift. The weight didn't disappear, but the balance was changing. Victor approached quietly, placing the recovered flash drive beside him. "We're not just defending your brother anymore," he said. "We're exposing a machine." Caleb nodded, eyes never leaving the skyline. "They kicked one boy," the narrator says, "and awoke a country that had been silent too long." The gavel struck once, and the courtroom fell into an unnatural stillness. Victor Wren stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate calm. Behind him, screens flickered to life, casting a faint blue glow across the wood-paneled walls. Caleb sat still at the defense table, his hands folded tightly, knuckles white. His jaw was clenched, but his expression was calm, more from discipline than peace. Across the room, Darren Voss shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the white bandage around his jaw standing out beneath the courtroom lights. His eyes darted from the screens to the crowded gallery where federal observers, journalists, and activists had packed every seat. Victor's voice rang clear. Let the court listen to the voices that were never meant to be heard. He pressed a button. The first recording played, a sharp burst of static, then Darren's unmistakable voice. "I'll make that kid move faster even if I have to kick him." A faint chuckle followed, another officer's voice murmuring encouragement. Gasps echoed around the room. The judge's eyes narrowed, his hands folded over the bench as he leaned forward. Caleb didn't move. He simply looked down, breathing slowly through his nose, every muscle in his body coiled tight. Next came the emails, projected onto the screen one by one. Mason Dre, seated quietly at the back, nodded once to Victor as confirmation. The digital trail showed clear evidence of Darren's supervisors encouraging firm deterrence against problem passengers to keep the checkpoint flow high, even if it meant bending protocol. One email read, "We need less leniency." If they slow us down, make an example." The judge turned pale. Darren's attorney stood in protest, but the judge waved him down. "You'll have your turn." Victor waited for the room to settle before turning slowly toward the jury. "My client didn't plan this. He didn't bring violence into that terminal. He responded to it. He responded the only way a brother could." He paused, then turned to the gallery. "But if truth needs one more voice, let it be his." Caleb blinked, confused for a moment. Then, as the side door opened, every eye turned. Malik Rowe stepped into the courtroom, guided by a court officer. He moved slowly, his crutches tapping against the marble floor. The hush in the room deepened. Even Darren sat frozen, his shoulders tense. Victor extended a hand. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Malik Rowe to the stand." The judge nodded once. Malik moved up the steps carefully, his right leg dragging slightly. He sat, adjusted the mic, and looked around. His voice, when it came, was soft but clear. "He kicked me," Malik said, his fingers tightening around the edge of the witness box, "because he thought I was weak." He looked directly at Darren, who looked away. "But my brother showed him that we aren't." The room was silent. Even the clicking of pens stopped. A few jurors swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. Victor stepped back, saying nothing more. There was nothing else to add. The judge took a long breath. He looked from Darren to Caleb, then down at the evidence. "This court has reviewed the footage, the audio, the emails, and heard the testimony from both sides," he said, his voice even but heavy. "We are not judging a single moment. We are weighing a pattern and an abuse of power." He picked up the verdict form and read clearly. "Darren Voss, you are found guilty of aggravated assault and abuse of authority. Caleb Rowe, you are hereby cleared of all charges." A murmur rippled through the room. Outside the windows, reporters scrambled to transmit the news. The judge continued. "Furthermore, I am recommending a full disciplinary review of Northgate International Airport's entire security division." Caleb exhaled, his first deep breath in weeks. Darren slumped in his seat, jaw twitching beneath the bandages. Malik stood from the witness box and began to hobble back down. Caleb met him halfway. The brothers embraced, tightly and without words. Around them, the courtroom burst into applause. Reporters rushed out the door, phones in hand. Malik leaned in and whispered, "We won, Caleb." And Caleb, for the first time in weeks, allowed himself a full smile. "Sometimes," the narrator concludes, "justice doesn't arrive quietly, it walks in on crutches and stands tall." The courtroom doors had barely closed before the world outside exploded. In the weeks following the verdict, the nation found itself swept into a storm of reckoning. The footage of Darren Voss kicking a disabled boy had burned itself into the public's memory. But it wasn't just the act that shocked people. It was the aftermath, the silence from leadership, the thin veil of excuses that had nearly buried the truth. And now, that veil had been ripped away. News vans parked outside airports from coast to coast. Commentators debated justice and restraint. Hashtags like #Justice for Malik and #Walk with Caleb trended across every platform. But it wasn't just noise. Something deeper was shifting. Policy hearings began popping up in local legislatures, and the Department of Civil Oversight issued a bold statement within days. A full-scale audit of airport security agencies is now underway. No exception. It was more than words. Teams of federal agents descended on airports, questioning officers, requesting internal logs, combing through years of complaints. Northgate International, the place where it all began, was their first stop. Inside a quiet apartment not far from the city, Caleb sat alone at his desk, staring at a paused video on his laptop screen. It was the same frame he had watched over and over. Malik falling, the crutches airborne, the scream echoing across sterile walls. Caleb's hand hovered over the spacebar, unsure whether to hit play again. His face, usually calm and collected, now carried the subtle weight of a man reliving the same moment in endless loops. The door creaked open behind him. "You're watching it again," Malik said, his voice soft but steady. Caleb turned, startled. "I thought you were asleep." Malik leaned on his crutch, stepping into the room. "I was." "Then I dreamed you were still blaming yourself." Caleb looked away. "Maybe I am." Malik came closer, setting the crutch against the wall and lowering himself onto the edge of the bed. "You didn't cause that moment." "He did. You just stopped it from going further." Caleb exhaled slowly. "Stopping it doesn't mean I don't see it every night." The room fell quiet, the only sound the low hum of passing traffic outside. Caleb finally closed the laptop. Malik, noticing, gave a small smile. "They asked me to talk at school today." To the new kid in a wheelchair. Said I should tell him how to speak up when people look at you like you're less. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Did you?" "I did more than that," Malik said. "I told him about you." In that moment, Caleb saw it, the light returning to his brother's eyes. Not the fragile gleam of survival, but the sturdy, unwavering confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was. And just like that, Caleb felt something shift inside him, not a grand revelation, but the first quiet breath of peace. Across town, Victor Wren stood at a lectern inside a university auditorium. Law students filled the seats, their pens scribbling furiously as he clicked to the next slide of his presentation. "This is the turning point," Victor declared. "This image, Caleb Rowe, kneeling beside his brother while officers circled him, is not a symbol of aggression. It is a moment of decision." And that decision sparked a movement. One student raised a hand. "Do you think he regrets it?" Victor smiled. "I think he regrets the world that made it necessary." Back at Northgate, the fallout continued. Darren Voss's dismissal had made the headlines, but the public's anger only grew when a leaked oversight report revealed a deeper sickness. Supervisors had instructed officers to assert control by intimidation, particularly when dealing with non-compliant passengers, including those with visible disabilities. The revelation hit hard. It wasn't one bad officer. It was a system built to favor obedience over dignity. Reporters flooded Caleb's inbox with interview requests. Editorials praised and criticized him in equal measure. Some called him brave. Others called him dangerous. Caleb answered none of them. He didn't want attention, he wanted accountability. Malik returned to school soon after the verdict. Though he still leaned on a crutch, his steps were steadier now. He began staying after class, talking to other students with mobility issues, offering quiet encouragement and advice. A boy named Theo, who had stopped using the cafeteria after being mocked, now sat proudly beside Malik at lunch. The small victories meant more than headlines. One afternoon, a teacher pulled Malik aside. "You're making a difference," he said. "You're helping more than you know." Malik shrugged, a faint smile curling. "I'm just doing what Caleb did for me." Across town, Caleb stood at the back of a packed community center, watching Victor speak at another panel. Every time Victor cited Caleb's name as a symbol of resistance, Caleb felt a strange mix of pride and discomfort. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a brother, a man who had one moment, 1 second, to choose between silence and justice. And though the cameras were gone and the courtrooms quiet, Caleb still carried the weight of that second. Late one night, as the city lights blinked outside his window, Caleb walked into the living room and found Malik watching an old animated movie they used to love. Malik didn't look up as he asked, "Do you ever wonder if it was worth it?" Caleb sat beside him, staring at the screen. "I used to," he admitted, "but not anymore." "Every time you smile like that?" "That's my answer," Malik nudged him. "You're getting soft," Caleb smirked. "Don't tell anyone." Outside, the city buzzed with new noise. Change was in motion. But inside that apartment, the quiet spoke volumes. Two brothers, scarred but unbroken, sitting side by side. Caleb had no awards on the shelf, no trophies to show, just the steady breathing of the boy beside him. And for him, that was enough. Sometimes, the narrator reflects, the hardest battles leave no trophies, only peace of mind. The camera flash lit up the chamber as Malik took the stage. His crutch echoed lightly against the polished floor, each step a reminder of the pain he had endured and the path he had walked since that day in the terminal. Rows of officials, security heads, civil rights leaders, and reporters filled the auditorium, all eyes fixed on the boy with the brace and the brother who never left his side. Behind Malik, Caleb stood silently, his hand resting firmly on the young boy's shoulder, a gesture not of guidance, but of quiet strength. The Civil Oversight Board had gathered to announce the culmination of a year's worth of investigations and policy reforms. Tensions ran high in the days leading up to the televised ceremony. Whispers had circulated that the reforms wouldn't go far enough, that politics would dilute justice, but when Chairman Ellis Forgrave stepped up to the podium with a thick folder in hand, silence fell. "We are not here today to hand out praise," Forgrave began, his voice deep and deliberate. "We are here because a child was kicked in a terminal, and no one stopped it until a brother, unarmed and unheard, chose not to look away." He gestured to the large screen behind him. A reel began to play, not of violence, but of change. Security officers assisting elderly passengers with gentle hands, greeting wheelchair users with respect, helping children with braces through checkpoints with kindness. The contrast was striking. Every frame reflected the new mandate: body cameras on all agents, independent review boards for reported misconduct, and above all, the Roe Amendment, etched in bold letters across the screen. Applause filled the room, slow at first, then thunderous. But Caleb didn't move. He stayed behind Malik, his expression unreadable, his hands clasped in front of him like a man holding something he couldn't quite release. When one of the organizers approached him with a mic, Caleb shook his head slightly and whispered, "Let him speak." Malik stepped forward to the podium. His hands gripped the edge tightly for balance, but his voice was steady. "My brother didn't fight to hurt anyone," Malik said. His gaze swept the room, lingering on the faces of officers who once may have looked away but now leaned forward with attention. "He fought to remind people that dignity is not a privilege, it's a right." His voice rang out across the chamber, not with the power of volume, but with the certainty of truth. A pause followed, heavy and sacred. Then came the applause again, louder, longer, unified. Reporters lowered their cameras. Even the most hardened officials remained quiet, as though realizing that policy could change behavior. But moments like this changed hearts. Caleb stepped up beside his brother, saying nothing. He simply placed his hand again on Malik's shoulder, anchoring the moment in silence. They stood there together, not as victims, not even as symbols, but as brothers who had faced something cruel and refused to stay quiet. Later that evening, under the pale orange glow of city street lamps, Caleb and Malik walked out of the building alone. The night was quiet, save for the soft hum of cars and distant footsteps. Caleb paused near the curb, drawing in a long breath of cold air. He glanced up at the stars hidden behind the haze and exhaled slowly, as if letting go of a weight he had carried too long. Behind him, Malik adjusted his crutch and gave a short chuckle. "They clapped for me," he said, not with pride, but with disbelief. "You earned it," Caleb replied softly, his eyes scanning the skyline. "Not because you stood at that podium, but because you stood at all." They walked on in silence, each step steady, measured, unbroken by memory or regret. The past could not be erased, but it could be used. Above them, the city loomed, indifferent, vast, and waiting, but now it moved just slightly to their rhythm. He knew their story had done more than punish one man. It had started a wave of change. And from the quiet pain of one moment, the narrator says, rose a movement too loud to ignore. A steady stream of passengers moved through Terminal B of Northgate International Airport, unaware they were walking across the quiet ground zero of a story that had once shaken the nation. Caleb Rowe stood still just beyond the security barrier, hands in the pockets of a navy wool coat, eyes tracking the flow of travelers like a silent observer cataloging motion, behavior, patterns. Beside him stood Malik, no longer the boy who had fallen screaming to the cold tile a year ago, but a young man with quiet fire in his eyes, balancing on a single black crutch, his injured leg now leaner, stronger, and steadier than it had ever been. They hadn't come here to relive the trauma. It wasn't about making a point or even finding closure. Caleb had resisted returning at first, hesitant to stir ghosts he'd spent months laying to rest. But Malik had insisted. "We have to walk through it," he'd said that morning, buttoning his jacket with slow precision. "Not around it. Through it." Now they stood side by side, watching a TSA officer gently guide a child in a wheelchair through the metal detector. Another agent offered the boy a reassuring thumbs up, smiling as the family passed. Caleb felt a small thud in his chest, recognition wrapped in disbelief. Northgate had changed. Malik leaned against his crutch and chuckled softly. "You see that?" he asked, his voice low but touched with pride. That boy didn't flinch. Nobody barked orders. No one shoved anything off the table. "I saw," Caleb said, nodding. "It's different." Then came the unexpected. A uniformed security officer broke from the line of guards at the far end of the checkpoint. He walked toward them with careful steps, shoulders slightly hunched as if he carried something heavier than duty. His name tag read P. Montrell, and his youth was apparent, no older than 26, maybe a fresh hire since the reforms. In his hand, he clutched a bottle of water with a slight tremble. He stopped in front of Malik, cleared his throat, and held out the bottle. "Sir," he said softly, barely above a whisper, "I just wanted to say, you changed how we see our job." Malik blinked, startled by the formal address. He hesitated, then reached out and took the water. "Thank you," he replied, his voice calm but filled with something deeper, an echo of the pain that had once screamed through his leg and into national headlines. The officer stepped back respectfully. "We have training now. Real training. They talk about what happened here. Your name's on a slide in the first class. They call it the Rowe Standard." Caleb looked at the young man, measuring his sincerity, then offered a slow nod. "Do your job right," he said evenly, "and no one will ever need to remember our names again." Montrell smiled faintly and returned to his post, disappearing into the flow of uniforms and announcements. For a moment, silence settled between the brothers. The distant hum of the conveyor belts, the soft ding of gate changes, the rise and fall of human conversation, all became background to something deeper. Malik stared ahead as a family passed, their little boy using crutches almost identical to his own. The child met his eyes, smiled shyly, and walked on. "I still have the brace in my closet," Malik said, not looking at Caleb. "Sometimes I want to burn it. Other times I think, maybe I should keep it." Just to remember, Caleb didn't answer at first. His thoughts drifted to Project Steadfast, the nonprofit they had built from the fallout. What started as an idea had become a full foundation, providing legal support, traveler protections, and reform blueprints for transit systems across the country. He was no longer an engineer of machines. He was an engineer of change, quietly, methodically, persistently. Malik shifted beside him, his voice lighter now. "You know, justice walks better on one leg than silence on two." Caleb snorted. "That line again?" "It's a classic." They both laughed, but beneath the humor was something sacred, something earned. Beyond the glass, planes lifted into the sky like silver arrows disappearing into low clouds. Caleb's eyes tracked one as it rose. This was the terminal where Malik had been kicked, where everything had unraveled. But now, people walked without fear. Children laughed. No one barked orders. The nightmare had become memory, and the memory had shaped something better. Jonas Cade's name flashed on a nearby monitor, this month's Integrity in Action Award. Malik pointed to it and smiled. Still can't believe he stuck his neck out for us. He didn't do it for us, Caleb said. He did it because it was right. They stood quietly again, letting the air speak for them. The airport had not changed because of one moment, but because of every moment after. The protests, the evidence, the trial, the judgment, the reform. And now, the reminder that justice didn't always need headlines, it just needed people who wouldn't back down. The announcer called for boarding at Gate 4A. A family passed them. The father wheeling a suitcase, the son leaning on a cane. The boy turned and gave Malik a curious nod, almost a salute. Caleb smiled faintly, then looked toward the wide terminal windows, where the tarmac glistened in the morning sun. The hum of engines rose again, layered with the gentle laughter of strangers beginning their journeys. No alarms, no shouting, no fear, just forward motion. Sometimes, the narrator concludes softly, justice doesn't roar, it walks quietly beside those who once fell, and rises every time they stand again. He thought kicking a boy on crutches made him powerful. Seconds later, his own Walkie was shoved down his throat. If you stand for dignity, justice, and accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of discrimination, abuse of power, and the swift consequences of cruelty and disrespect. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire empathy, justice, and accountability in the face of prejudice and mistreatment.